Well, hello there, and welcome back to yet another FileMaker tutorial video bringing you more information about FileMaker Pro. My name is Matt Petrowski, bringing you these tutorials over at FileMakerMagazine.com. In this particular video, we are taking a look at a very cool topic. I am so excited about this. We're talking about beautiful interactive custom charts. We're using the free D3 JavaScript library in order to accomplish some really amazing stuff. So let's take a look at the file and see what we have access to. All right, so let's take a look at our example. What I have on screen is basically just your simple pie chart, except it's formatted in the format of a donut. Now, if you've worked with any of FileMaker's existing charts, you know that this is not one of the possibilities. So clearly, right off of the bat, I am not using FileMaker's custom charts. Now, FileMaker's custom charts, or FileMaker's charting tool, is very intuitive. It's easy to put on, but it doesn't provide you with a lot of interactivity. In fact, the reason that I've titled this particular video Interactive Custom Charts is because this chart, being that it's composed within a web viewer, allows for full interaction. Now, the only thing that you can do with a FileMaker chart is you can simply make the chart, the whole of the chart, clickable itself, but you cannot click on the individual components within the chart. However, within a web viewer, you can clearly click on any possible individual part of an HTML document. Now, we're not going to go through HTML, CSS, and JavaScript at length. I can't give you everything that you need to know in order to fully take advantage of this library, but I am going to show you how I integrated this in about a half an hour, relatively quickly. Took it straight off of the web, and I'm using my own FileMaker data. In fact, you can see right here that I have these data points where I have 58, 100, 46, down to 25. Now, I am limited specifically in this example to these 5 data points, but you are in no way limited by any constraints when you use the D3 JavaScript library. You can pass it as much information as you want. In fact, when we take a look at some of the examples, or when you go take a look at some of the examples, you will be blown away at what you can integrate into your FileMaker database. So watch what happens as I change this value here from 56 or 58 to 800. You can clearly see that we have an overwhelming percentage, 79.6% in relation to all of the other values. As soon as I make this one 1,000, my data then reflects. So you can see that this is absolutely cool, that this data is coming directly from my FileMaker portal data right there. As I change it, it's live. Now, what's really cool about this is I want you to envision if you had a web viewer on, let's say, a dashboard, and if you were to, for example, set an on-timer script that maybe would pull for data, or just the mere fact that FileMaker attempting to update all clients, as soon as any reference data does get updated, if this web viewer is triggered to refresh, it would simply refresh exactly like we're seeing real time, where I change this value right here and you get this nice transition. Or if it's a very drastic change, we're going to get that change right there. Now, there's this button right here that says change data. Now, this is a random function that's built into the JavaScript that we'll take a look at, which basically is showing you what it could actually look like in your FileMaker solution as things are changing. That's because D3 has transitions built in. Now, the really, really big key point about this is not just that you can interact with each of these individual parts. In fact, I could make this clickable, I could make the text clickable, I could make the purple part clickable, I can make things happen when I hover over objects. You'll see all of this in all of the D3 examples, some of which we'll walk through. But the cool key aspect of this is that because we're rendering this within a web viewer, we have full access to the technology that's baked into the web viewer, and that happens to be SVG, Scalable Vector Graphics. Now, this is something that FileMaker currently does not have built in to its own rendering system. In other words, you can't implement or integrate or drop in a SVG graphic and have that be directly on the layout or baked within a button or within any other object. Hopefully they'll get to that point. But within the web viewer, you can certainly build anything that is SVG based on the web viewer support. So here in WebKit, where Safari is being used on this Macintosh, and over on IE, all you need to do is make sure that the browser on the OS is of a current version that it does implement and support SVG. And it's been around for a while, so most of the time it's pretty well supported. Now, the way that you get your FileMaker data into the web viewer so that it can be used is that it has to be in a format that D3, which is built in JavaScript, can actually use. But fortunately, this is very easy to do, and D3 supports many different formats. You can use just your standard JavaScript object, which is what I've done in this particular example file. Or you can directly reference external files saved as CSV or a couple other formats, JSON, I believe XML possibly. If not, you can convert that if needed. The whole point is, as long as you can get the data in the format from FileMaker so that you can use this D3 library, there are so many things that you can create. So for the rest of this video, let's take a walkthrough of where I actually went, how I got the example, and then how I integrated it so that I could use my own FileMaker data. So moving into the integration part, we can take a look at all of the individual components. Now before, if you haven't worked with HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, I don't want you to be afraid because pretty much everything I did in this example file was copied directly from the web. I just sort of modified what was out there on the web and then put it into FileMaker and used FileMaker's functions in order to integrate my own data. So as I head into layout mode, what we're going to see is that quite clearly I have a web viewer here on the layout. Now when I double click to open this web viewer, and I'll resize the window, and we'll open up the actual calculation dialog box. The first thing that you're going to see here on screen is all of the data. All of this information right here, which is at the beginning of this let statement. I've simply created a memory-spaced variable called JavaScript array object. Now, all I'm doing is I'm using the list function in order to get my FileMaker data into a format that JavaScript likes. Now, JavaScript has these two different things that it uses for notation. These brackets right here, and then these braces. Now, the braces are what includes an array. This is basically an array right here. Or some people, there's so many other names in other languages. It could be called a map. There's so many different things that it is called, but in JavaScript, I believe it is called an array. Now, the object right here, which are these brackets, are simply containing multiple different arrays. And these arrays simply have all of the different pieces of information that I need to use in order to be passed to D3, and in particular, a script that's using D3 in order to render that nice, beautiful donut-looking pie chart. The first thing you can see right here is it wants a label, it wants a value, and then it also wants a color. So if I was to say, for example, change this right here from the 3366cc, I can very easily change the color of the actual chart, the pie chart that's being rendered. Now this to me is extremely cool. This is the type of flexibility and control that I want that FileMaker does not give me. FileMaker charting only gives me label sets and then it repeats all of its colors. It doesn't allow me to individually control every single color for every single object however I want. That's what D3 gives me the advantage of, is being able to do that. Now you can see that all I have done is I've used a FileMaker list function and I took this template from a specific place. I actually took it from the code that was on the example page. And the only thing that I needed to modify was I needed to integrate or inject this particular string right here. I needed to inject the value. Where is the value of the data that's used in order to render the chart going to come from? And quite clearly, you can see that I'm using the getInthRecord. I'm looking through a relationship, which is my portal, and I'm saying I want you to use record 1, record 2, 3, 4, and 5. So out of all of these items, I want you to recognize how simple this is. This is the only thing that I really needed to know was, where is my FileMaker data coming from? Can I put it? I need to put it in the format that's expected in order to render this information, and then everything else was taken care of for me. So let's talk about all of the everything else, all of the rest of the stuff. Clearly, because we're in a web viewer, we need this to be HTML. So that's everything that you see right here, starting up at the top with this doc type. Now, this HTML, again, is all being formatted within a list function. I'm using FileMaker's ability to specify that this HTML is not coming from outside on the web, but coming directly from within the content inside FileMaker. That's where you use this data text HTML. The rest of it embedded within this list function, and you don't have to use a list function. In fact, many times I actually like to keep the HTML outside on the layout in a simple text block, and we're going to see that. And that's because it doesn't force me to have to do all of this quote escaping. Every time that I have this backslash in front of a quote, I'm having to escape that quote as a quote that's embedded within the quotes that FileMaker uses to wrap around an actual string. All I needed to do was I needed to get in all of the constituent parts that are required for the D3 library to render its content within a web viewer. Now, the really cool thing about D3 and the really cool thing about JavaScript and jQuery and many other libraries is that the way that they work on the DOM is they can simply look across all of these individual tags. And these individual tags can be clearly identified, typically by what's either known as an ID or a class or the actual name itself. For example, this tag head clearly is differentiated from this tag body. So if I know that I want to interact with the body tag, or I want to, say, for example, put something after the body tag, all I have to do is target that particular tag and then say, you are going to inject this piece of information or this item into this area of the whole of this HTML document. So in a lot of the D3 examples, what you'll see is just a very, very basic rough skeleton of HTML. And then what D3 does is D3 dynamically generates and creates an SVG, but it's actually not limited to SVG. D3 basically stands for data. You can find it on the website. It's like 3 different words that deal with data manipulation. It just basically takes data and then allows you to parse it out and push it into a structure that will actually make sense. In this case, SVG is really cool because it will render perfectly on our desktop and on all of our high-resolution devices. So, getting back to that injecting that I was talking about, you can see right here that there is this body, and then what I'm doing within that body is I'm simply using FileMaker's substitute function. In fact, as we zoom in here, remember what I said is one of my preferred ways of getting HTML into a web viewer is to actually have that HTML stored directly within the layout within a text block. I'm doing that with this function right here, an extremely powerful function called getLayoutObjectAttribute. I can look at the content of any given text block and pull it out and then do whatever I want to that particular text block. So you can see right here, I'm looking at a text block named HTML, and I'm substituting a number of things out. The first thing that I'm substituting is this portion or this string of text, which reads source equals d3.min.js. Now this is the JavaScript library. I simply downloaded it from the d3js.org website. I'm going to show you where it exists within the layout, and I simply am pulling that into the HTML, and I'm substituting where it normally is linked, say, for example, to an external website or to a relative document named d3.min.js, and I'm substituting it with a global variable. So clearly the global variable needs to have been shoved in, or shoved in is a bad word, it needs to have been pre-filled with the JavaScript library. And that's basically all I do. On the startup of a solution, if there's a JavaScript library that I'm going to be using solution-wide, meaning not just in one web viewer on one layout, but in many different web viewers throughout my whole solution, I opt to simply shove that whole JavaScript into a global variable. It's usually only a few hundred K at the most, and basically allows you to reference that solution-wide. So you can see that I've done that for the complementary JavaScript, which was actually written specifically for this example called donut, incorrectly spelled, but nonetheless, a separate script that uses the D3 library. So first, the D3 library has to be loaded in order for the donut 3D JavaScript to use the D3 library in order to render our nice, attractive graph. Now again, I copied these directly from the web. I'm going to show you where. And again, this was also shoved into a global variable and is being referenced. The final thing that I have right here is that I took the original HTML and I put in a known value, a value that I know that I can actually swap out. In this case, I simply called it FMP data because I knew that that didn't conflict with anything else. So if this substitute function finds FMP data, then what it's going to stick in its place is a JavaScript array object. And that's everything that we saw up here up at the top, which is all of my FileMaker data formatted as JavaScript the way that JavaScript needs in order to render this nice, beautiful pie chart. So having gone through that, let's take a look at all of the individual parts and where they are. As we scroll off to the side, you are going to see all of the individual pieces that are making this work. Right here, I clearly have a text object called d3.min.js. Now, I've shown this in videos prior, but the way that I integrate all of my JavaScript libraries is after I download the library within the operating system actually has a file name. And in most cases, it's whatever.js, min.js, or it's the full version.js. All I do is I open that file in a text editor, come into FileMaker, paste in the text, and then go over to the inspector. And as you can see right here, I simply give the name of the object the exact same name that the file has. In this case, d3.min.js. Then on startup, all I do is I load this library as part of my startup script. So we can see if I go to my manage scripts and I see this solution startup script. So basically this technique has a technique startup, which is actually linked within this main startup. There's a lot of different scripts here that are used, but that's just because of the script. You really only have to have one script in order to accomplish what I'm doing here with these three. But basically, we simply need to load that JavaScript library. Here's where it actually happens. You can see that I am loading into that global variable, which I'm referencing within my web viewer, using the getLayoutObject attribute. So you obviously need to be on the correct layout where the actual text object is, but if I use the getLayoutObject attribute, reference the object that I've simply put onto the layout, I'm using the content keyword, shoving that into the global variable, then it's there and it's available for my whole of my solution. Very easy, very simple once you get the concept. So once those two libraries are loaded, this one and then the supplementary script, which I copied from the web, the only other things that I need are the CSS, which is used in order to actually render the content, including some of the styling, such as outlines, opacity you can see right here, stroke widths you can control, fonts you can control. Here's a very important one. The background color is one of the values that you need to be aware of. If I was to put this web viewer on a white background, this would clearly need to read FFFFFF for the color white. Or I could just put the keyword white in here if you're familiar with CSS. But basically, all of the CSS is going to control the rendering. The rest of the equation was the HTML itself. So at this point, I think it's a really good idea to go over and take a look at the example. In fact, as I scroll up here, you're going to see that I have the URL right here. It is at blox.org or blocks.org, which was created by Mike Bostock. In fact, he's the creator of the D3 library, and this is just an absolutely awesome website, the Blocks website. In fact, it's in the More tab in this particular example file. If we go back into browse mode and we click on the More tab, what you're going to see is Mike Bostock's Blocks. And as I scroll through this, you are going to see quite literally hundreds and hundreds of examples of SVG output within browsers, which obviously can go within web viewers, that you could do. And every one of these examples has the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript on the page. These bar charts, extremely easy to integrate with copy and paste, provided you become comfortable and familiar with working with these technologies. But there are things that are so complex, such as rendering the United States or geographic maps. Look at this, a population choropleth. I mean, there is just some crazy, insane things. And this scales. You zoom in, and as you zoom in, it retains its resolution, no matter what the device. It's beautiful, I tell you. If you want to go through all of the examples, you can certainly go through those on your own time. I'm going to show you this simple example that I used and how I got it in. Heading back into layout mode, scrolling over, we can see all of the HTML. So where did I get all of this code? Well, as I switch over to Safari and we go to the actual example, here I have it loaded right here. We can see that we have this exact example that I have directly within the FileMaker web viewer where you can click the change data. I simply opted to hide this second chart right here. I did that by simply commenting it out. In fact, if we switch back over to FileMaker, you can see right here quite clearly that I have commented out in this area the donut draw quotes donut. And I've also commented out the sales donut, which references the random data. That is a JavaScript function that is within this particular example. I knew that the random data was what I wanted to replace with my FileMaker Pro data. So you can see that I copied this particular line right here, this line, and I put it right up here above and simply swapped out the FMP data. That's how easy it was in order to get this working. Back over to the web page. As I scroll down, all that I did was I took everything that was here and simply copied it into all of its constituent parts. Now, I happen to know that I needed the donut3d.js. This is all of the complex math that's actually making the donut with the inner circle. This is all the stuff that I personally could probably never do because I am not a math person. But thanks to the person who created this example, it is all here, and it just needed to be copied and pasted into FileMaker Pro. What you need to know, and what I figured out, was that I simply need to know where do I replace, out of this example, my FileMaker data for what this example is showing. Well, in my case, having worked with JavaScript, I knew that sales data was the data that was being used in order to render. But this is not all of the data that's being used. This is only the label and the color. Looking down here at the bottom where we can see this function random data, we can see that quite clearly what was actually generating the graph is this call right here, donut.draw, sales donut, and the data that it's using is random data. So that's where I knew I needed to replace this with my FMP data. So that's why I copied that line. But I also needed to understand, what does random data actually supply? So I needed to go look at the random data function, see that what it returns is sales data map. So now I need to find out, here's sales data. So it's basically this map function is going to take a map of sales data, walk across each one of these, and it's going to run a particular function. That function is going to in turn return whatever it finds in the label. So for the first one, it finds basic. The value, which is what it's going to inject, is what I need to put in as my FileMaker data. So in this case, he's using 1000 times math random in order to generate a random value. That's what's actually happening when you click on the button create random or create data. So I knew that this was the basic structure that I needed, which we already took a look at, that I simply copied, put into a FileMaker list, and then simply went right into the middle of this section and said, I need to get my record data. And that's where I'm using the get nth record, looking into the portal and getting record 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and so on. So you're obviously going to, if you want a fully dynamic chart, you're going to need to modify and adapt what I have in this example to say, for example, if you need to work with more data, you can obviously generate as many different data points for the pie chart as desired, or a bar chart, or whatever it is that you're working with. As long as you know that the data is in the structure that can be used by D3 and any complementary script, which in this case is Donut 3D, then you are good to go with using this within your FileMaker web viewers. And again, what makes this so cool is not just the fact that you can interact with it, because you can integrate FileMaker's FMP URL. These are all clickable objects within FileMaker. It's a little bit beyond the scope of this video, but you definitely need to know that it's certainly possible to do. You just have to decide how you're going to do it, and it really depends on the chart that you're actually integrating in terms of how you're going to make objects clickable. You'll need to inspect the HTML, look at an SVG object within a inspector. In fact, I'll give you a tip. Anytime you're within any type of browser, all you have to do is, if there's something that you want to understand, is simply right-click in either Safari, Chrome, or in Firefox. And most of them will have this item right here called Inspect Element. And when you select Inspect Element, what it will do is it will bring up the source code behind the scenes and allow you to simply walk through and look at all of the constituent parts that make up that particular object within HTML. And quite clearly, you will see individual components within the SVG object where you can embed on-click objects, which can reference the FMP URL, making it so that you can store data such as a primary key or any type of parameter that you might want to pass to the script that you actually call, making all of these individual items clickable. And that's what makes this so powerful. But beyond that, everything within a web viewer is scrollable. So in my particular case, what I want you to envision is I had a need where, let's say, for example, I had many more data points than I have right here. Let's say I had a lot of data points, 50, 100, 200. Clearly, that wouldn't work in the case of a pie chart. That's when I need to, for example, go to a bar chart. But if I was to use a FileMaker chart is limited to the dimensions that it actually can show, which is then limited to the dimensions of the device or the screen that the user is on. It's not scrollable, but yet a web viewer can be scrolled. So if, say, for instance, this was not a pie chart, but instead a bar chart that had 200 different data points, that would not be something that I could show within a FileMaker chart. But within a web viewer, very easily, I could allow the user to scroll up and down, such as I'm doing right now within this web viewer, and scroll through a list of all kinds of different data points, being able to provide the user with the ability to select on that and head to whatever I want according to whatever my script is telling it to do. Load those related records, go to a list view and only show certain records, filter records by however I want. It is just really awesome stuff. So I think I've done a pretty good job of explaining everything here in terms of how to integrate. I simply went to the web page that is referenced here, which you can do as well. I broke all of its little constituent parts out, such as loading the scripts that are required, making sure those load, loading the CSS and breaking that out so that I can edit it. You can see that its object name is CSS, breaking out the HTML, and then substituting out in the HTML or in the CSS as necessary directly within the web viewer what will actually give me the result that I want. by putting in my own FileMaker data. I think that makes sense. Every one of these get_inth records is simply pulling the data, putting it into a JavaScript object, which is contains multiple arrays, and then injecting that directly into the HTML that I copied straight from the web page. Absolutely awesome stuff in terms of what you can do. So what I'd like to do before I wrap this up is I'd like to give you a few more pointers of where you can get more information. Clearly, we have the documentation, which is available over at the d3js.org website. That's the URL that you'll find right within this web viewer, or if you can remember it, it's pretty easy, d3js.org. When you go to that website, they have an examples area that is separate from Mike Bostock's website. But as you scroll down here, you're going to see a plethora of really complex, awesome examples. Switching over to Safari, I'm just going to show you a few that I've been extremely impressed with. This one, bi-level partition. How cool would it be to have your FileMaker data represented in this fashion, using whatever colors you want, however you want. So I can click on the green, and it will focus on that section and then render those out. I can click in the middle, it will zoom back out. Focus on the pink, zoom back out. This is all interactivity that you will never get natively within FileMaker Pro that would make your solution shine. Just absolutely awesome stuff. And as a final example, and these are only the tips of the iceberg, this is a fully interactive, pretty much driven by D3 PyGraph, but it's not just PyGraph. You notice here that you can select on this side, have these pop-outs. I can choose a different style. I can choose a bar chart and have that rendered with all kinds of transitions. You can see as the data is updated, what happens as it moves. Just really cool stuff. I can go back and pick a completely different style. I can do a world cloud with words. It is amazing, I tell you. A zoomable map. I don't know how long this is going to load, but I can zoom in on this. I can move it around. Again, it's all going to scale because it's all SVG within the web browser. In fact, I've got to give credit where credit is due. Vince Manano is the person who pointed me to D3. He's been using it in his inspector product for a number of years, I think, ever since, I don't know if it's ever since D3 came out, but I didn't fully grasp what D3 was until I spent some time with it. I didn't know that it's basically just a data library that allows you to rip through data and then format that however you want, whether it's just into a basic HTML chart or into one of the most complex, extreme SVG, fully interactive web viewers that you could ever envision. That's what D3 allows you to do. So play with the examples, go through the file, find out how easy it is to actually interact and basically inject your data into these really awesome D3 charts. As always, I'd like to wish you much luck with your own FileMaker development, and until next time, happy FileMaking.